If your kids are athletes who spend much of their time playing a sport, you might wonder what it's all for sometimes, since only a small percentage of people actually move on to play at a professional level. But my next guest, although a professional athlete himself, says playing sports would have been worth it no matter what the outcome because of the valuable life lessons he learned along the way. You'll want to tell your boys and your husband who you saw on Studio 5 today. Mika is here. He plays center for the NBA G League Ignite. In college, you may have recognized him. He played for Brigham Young University, and he and his wife are high school sweethearts and recently welcomed their second child into the world. And he joins me to share why it's worth it to put your kids in sports. You're preaching to the choir because I'm a believer. I'm a believer, but let's talk about your origin story.
Yeah.
How did it all start?
You know, I played all the sports growing up, and lacrosse was actually my #1 sport. A lot of people don't know that about me. For whatever reason, I gravitated towards it. My older brother played, so I was probably just trying to be like him. I ended up switching high schools, though, when I was a junior to Lone Peak for reasons outside of sports. But when I got there, Lone Peak was kind of at their peak, no pun intended, of basketball. Like they were this factory and had a lot of really good players, a lot of good players that went on and played professionally, and also colleges all over the place. So when I got there, it kind of just made sense for me to go all in with basketball, and it took off from there.
Yeah, and your height can't hurt. I mean, when you're as tall as you are, people ask you all the time, sure, oh, you play basketball?
Well, lacrosse, I kind of got sick of getting like hit in the hip. I kept getting hit in the hip by the stick, so I was like, let's just go with basketball.
Okay, so you have a new podcast coming out called Now for Later, and you're kind of talking about how sports is preparing you for when you're not playing sports later.
Yeah, so kind of the genesis of the podcast was I came home this year. I had a short season because the G League is a little bit shorter than overseas. And so I had some time on my hands. I decided to do an internship with a company in Salt Lake. And just being there for a week, I was like, why didn't I do this earlier? You know, I have a lot of skills and things that will translate to life after sports, but I need to be learning the language and kind of building my own adapter so that I can actually use them once I'm done. So the more athletes I talked to, current and past, the more it seemed like this was a missing thing. Like this resource is a real need. Athletes need to hear these stories and find ways to be better prepared now while they're still playing for life after sports, because it's inevitable. Whether you stop playing after middle school or high school, or you go as far as John Stockton, who is one of our guests, like it's gonna come to an end, so why not prepare for it now?
Yeah, so are you talking to all players or are you talking to all athletes? Who are your guests?
So they're all athletes, and I think we do a really good job of bringing on these big names and these athletes that have iconic stories and legendary stats. I mentioned Don Stockton, like him, right? But then we also have a balanced list of athletes that you've never heard of, right? That stopped playing after high school, decided not to go play college, or maybe couldn't go play college even though they would have loved to, and figured out how they were complete people before they were athletes, so that once it did come to an end, whether they wanted it to or not, they were prepared for that next step.
Okay, I love this. I love this so much. Okay, so you have 3 things that athletes can gain from playing a sport. So we're going to talk about those.
Yes.
And your first one is it teaches patience and hard work.
It does. I think everyone that has played a sport would agree with me. And the story that came to mind was about a teammate I had this last year with G League Ignite. His name is Sharif ONeal. If you're into basketball, you've probably heard of him. If you're not into basketball, you've probably still heard of him because his dad is Shaquille O'Neal. He had open heart surgery right when he got to college. He was a big-time recruit, went to UCLA. Like everything was in front of him. He was about to get started on this journey and become a pro, I'm sure, a little bit quicker than he ended up doing regardless. And they found something in his physical, so he had to go get surgery. He couldn't do anything for, I think, almost 2 years. It was 1 year and 7 months before he could even lift things. But he was patient, he persevered, he kept working, he kept believing, and he ended up a pro, a little bit longer or later on than he had expected originally, but he's playing at a high level again. So, hearing his story as his teammate and then again on the podcast was really inspirational.
Well, this is exactly what you're doing because he had to find out who he was not being an athlete.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He had to start thinking, well, I'm probably never going to play again. So how am I developing myself as a human? If I'm not going to play basketball, like, how am I going to identify myself?
Okay, awesome. Your next one is just getting kids out of their comfort zone.
Yep, another good one. Again, I'm going to talk about a teammate I had this last year who's also been on the podcast. It just made sense. His story is still fresh in my mind. His name is Eugene Jett. His nickname is Pooh, like Winnie the Pooh. There he is right there next to Victor Wembanyama, who was the #1 pick this last draft. And he played for 17 years. He just retired, and he started with a front office in Portland. And so he's transitioning, making this very switch right now. But he was this incredible example to me of getting out of his comfort zone, because the second someone that he didn't know walked into the gym, which happened all the time, because you have these scouts, you have general managers, you have you have sponsors and boosters, like all these people that are in the business side of sports. If he didn't know them, he got to know them immediately. He was the first one to go greet them, shake their hand, get to know them, tell them his story, and make like a genuine connection. And that's something that's hard for kids to do, like go and just talk to a stranger. That's hard for me to do. That's hard for everyone to do, not just kids. So seeing him in action was super inspiring. He's got an incredible network because of it, and he got used to being uncomfortable, and he's going to be set up for life because of it.
Yeah, and your next one, I think, is like, yes, of course this happens, that kids are going to set goals and they're going to believe in themselves a little bit more by playing sports.
Yeah, this is where I get to highlight my story.
Okay, let's do it.
No, goal setting is so important. Writing these things down and the steps that then follow, and then executing them, right? There's a lot of steps to it, but you have to set the goal. You have to then write what are the steps that you can get to the goal, and then you have to go do it, right? So there's 3 parts to it. I did that, right? So I left BYU. Unfortunately, I wasn't drafted, right? I thought my life was over. Like I actually talked about this on my first episode, and I cried like the whole night. Like I thought it was over. I didn't want to play. I didn't want to show my face. It was so embarrassing. But I wrote down these goals regardless, saying it doesn't matter. You're going to make it. You're going to play in the NBA. These are the things you're going to do. Now go do it. And I did it. And I made it to the NBA 3 years later. I was consistent, I worked hard, and I believed in myself and this plan that I had developed. And I got there. And I don't think there's a better way to learn these lessons than in sports. Sports is just like this microcosm of life. You learn these lessons so much quicker. A lesson that might take years to learn in regular life, you might learn in a single practice as you play a sport.
Okay, so you've got me hooked. I'm going to listen.
Good.
Just anywhere I can get my podcast.
Yep.
And when is it out? When is it coming out?
So we call it episode 0 is out right now. That's me, that's my story, why I'm doing the podcast. I mean, basically what we've talked about here in like a 40-minute episode. We like to keep it semi-short and sweet. And you can listen to it on Apple. You can listen to it on Spotify. We have an Instagram page that's super active that will announce future guests and do fun reels and clips. That's at Now for Later Pod. So follow that. Go check us out on anywhere that you can find a podcast and follow along. We're going to have some incredible guests. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Okay, well, my basketball obsessed son and I will tune in.
He should.
Okay, thank you, Eric.
Thank you.